Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today on Barnes& Noble Midday Mystery. I am S.A. Cosby, author of Razorblade Tears and Blacktop Wasteland, and I am joined today by Lisa Gardner, author of many books, but the one we're going to talk about today is One Step Too Far. So I'm going to let Lisa introduce herself. So glad to see you and so glad to meet you.
Thank you, Sean, and it's a pleasure to be here. Sean and I have gotten to interact briefly through International Thrill Writers and as fellow suspense novelists. I love Razorblade Tears and highly recommend it, and we'll get into more, our mutual admiration society as we go. But I'm here today for One Step Too Far, which Sean is graciously, playing the ringleader of, and it involves Frankie Elkin returning. This is her second book. And this time around, our amateur sleuth, who has no background or official training, on a whim hears about a search for a lost hiker in the woods. It's a private effort at this point. It's the father, some family, friends, a guide, all headed off to find this poor boy because his dying mom wants to see the mom one last time. And let's just say, bad things ensue, as true with any good thriller. So how are you today, Sean?
I've read the book. Well, I've read the book. I've read it, and it's an amazing novel. As a fellow writer, but also a voracious reader, I am amazed when I read an author who can do things that I can't do. It's almost like two magicians trying to surprise each other, and I was pleasantly surprised by some of the twists and turns in One Step Too Far. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the book, I do have a couple questions I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to get this one out of the way because this is the one that we always ask. Where did you get your ideas from? Because for me, Frankie gave off sort of this, I don't want to say amateur true crime kind of enthusiast vibe. I mean, that's not really what she is, but that's what the kind of feeling I got. And so were you inspired by any of that kind of subculture, which is, exploded during the pandemic? I mean, I think everybody and their mama has a true crime podcast. Yeah. So was that any kind of inspiration for you at all?
Yes, I believe, Sean, you just nailed it right on the head right there. It is interesting. When I first started my career a couple decades ago, it was all about profilers and serial killers. And it was really that lifting that veil that there was these magic people that worked for the FBI who would look at like a photo of a crime scene and tell you, he buttons his coat on the left side. And that seems so crazy. In this day and age, we're getting back to the cold cases and everyone, the everyday people who are getting involved in solving cold cases. So in the case of One Step Too Far, it has to do with this phenomenon where I'm a hiker. I live in the mountains of New Hampshire. And I end up just reading about this whole thing where there's 1,600 people still missing on national public lands. It's everything from the small child that wandered away from a campfire to a hiker such as Timothy O'Day in One Step Too Far who disappears. And almost by definition, all of this is volunteer run. So when someone goes missing, the first few weeks, 8 weeks, maybe 12 weeks, you will get the locals, you'll get the National Guard, you'll get volunteer pilots, search and rescue teams, but they're all volunteers. Sooner or later, they go back to their own lives. The missing person has not been found. That family has no closure. And this creates this huge gap of, again, these 1,600 people that are not just missing, no one's looking for them. And this is where it becomes just the everyday people. The family raise funds. This is real life. Other people like Frankie will Bigfoot hunters we learn about One Step Too Far. Often they're out in the woods like, well, as long as I'm here, I'm going to look here's these unsolved cases. Here are these people we're still looking for. But the inspiration behind Frankie is very much all of us everyday locked up pandemic crazy souls are starting to play more and more of a role in working cold cases.
I find that fascinating because I'm a hiker and I live in Virginia, and I live like in the lower central part of Virginia.
Great state.
And I think some people, yeah, it's beautiful, beautiful. Got the Appalachian Trails, park goes through here, the Blue Ridge Parkway, so on and so forth. But I don't think the average person who hasn't been out in the woods in a while realizes how easily people can go missing. You can stumble off of a trail, you can trip down a ravine, you could fall and hurt yourself and just be literally 100 yards from the trail, but too weak holler out or call for help. So I thought that was interesting too. I'm fascinated with the missing 411 and people who are the missing in national parks, and I think I'm too fascinated with it actually, but but that was why the book really yeah. I think that's why the book really appealed to me. But you spoke about Frankie. Can you give us a little bit more background on her for people who haven't read the previous novel?
Sure. So Frankie Elkin first appeared last year and Before She Disappeared. But they're two very distinct books in terms of plot. So you can read one without the other. But what we learned from her, and she was again inspired from some real life things we have going on, is she's not a private investigator. She's not law enforcement. I mean, I think I've done FBI agents, cops, PIs, the whole gamut. She's none of that. She's us. She's a proxy for the everyday average person. The difference being she's really obsessed with finding the missing, the world's forgotten. And that's really her niche. And she's very aware of it, that in all of these missing person cases in the world, there's so many that fall through the cracks, many involving minorities, many involving geographies, and one in particular now in this book happens to be with our national parks. It's not just that people are gone, it's that no one's looking. And the pain of those families is very real to her. But more to the point, I think Frankie is this woman she's searching herself. Who is she? I mean, she doesn't have a real job. She doesn't have a house. She doesn't have a stable relationship. She is a recovering alcoholic. And there's certainly something about this obsession of throwing herself into other people's problems that are help keeping her sober. But I think of all the characters I've ever written, I don't even know Frankie. And that's somewhat the appeal of the books. They're all about the search to try to find someone. It's very real, very practical. Frankie's a problem solver. She has to be asked, well, if you're sitting in your living room, what would you do to solve this problem? Those are the resources she has. But it's also still the why of her. I think it's just incredibly compelling. Frankie herself can't necessarily answer that question, why she does it, but she knows it works.
I find it fascinating too that the I won't say trope, but the truism, I guess, in crime fiction of the unlicensed troubleshooter private eye. You got everyone from I love that idea. You got everybody from Easy Rawlins to George Pelecanos' Nick character to everything in between. And so I find that it's fascinating because those characters can sometimes do press the bound. And I found it interesting that the main in Wyoming, and that is a beautiful state, but in that beauty is an incredibly expansive and somewhat dangerous terrain. And so what was do you have a personal connection to Wyoming, or what was the reason for setting it in that area?
So, it's interesting for me. One Step Too Far is my pandemic book. Before She Disappeared came out during it, but most of the writing had happened before. And so there's a couple things that definitely influenced it. One was, like a lot of people who, now we're shut down, we have to be at home. I went outdoors more than ever. So I'd always been a hiker, but now I became a big hiker, to a point that my friends and I, as we started to do these backwoods trails that there's no cell service, there's no one to call when things go wrong. We're like, we really should take a survival course. So, we have some due diligence here. And then the thought, so that got me into kind of survival in the wilderness. When things go wrong, what do you do? And basically involves knives and fire. And if you're a suspense novelist, how can you not like anything that involves knives and fires? But I also like the mystique of Wyoming. I think we just long for wide open spaces. I mean, as much as I love the mountains of New Hampshire, Wyoming's a whole nother scale. And then you get the grizzly bears and you're so off the beaten path. I think it was kind of my fantasy novel. One step too far. Poor Frankie ends up in terrible danger, but I just really enjoyed going for a hike in Wyoming. That's really what the book's about.
One of these days, hopefully, when we're all in a comfortable setting, preferably with whiskey, I'll have to tell you my story about running
I can't wait.
from a grizzly bear in Montana.
I've never met one. So I want to hear your story. We just have black bears and they're not terribly dangerous. You just have to give them some space. But I so want to hear that story. So yes,
I'm so
absolutely.
happy to see me. a grizzly and a mason jar full of moonshine. But anyway, I digress.
That's awesome. That's totally awesome. Sean will be writing our next installment.
A little bit. I know everybody has a and I don't want to ask, are you a pantser or a plotter? Because I think those kind of distinctions are becoming a little bit irrelevant. I think it's all about what you do with that. But are you someone who does do extensive research before you begin the novel? Or do you find the story and then fill in the blanks with the research you need, if that makes sense? I'm sorry if that question is confusing.
I like how you're saying that. I think they're slightly different, but I think those are both valid questions. So in my case, I start with research. And often my books are inspired by something in research. Like, I had a couple female friends. We took this wilderness survival course. And by the end of it, we're all a little bit of a giggly mess. We're kind of like, this has to be a book. This is too good not to be a book. And then it was like, okay, so talking to search and rescue people and really the strategy for how you find someone in the woods, particularly when you're monitoring volunteers. I mean, because that's really what it comes down to. It's kind of herding of cats was fascinating to me. How much of search and rescue looking for a lost person, whether it's a hiker, a toddler, an elderly person, comes down to some psychology. What are the most likely steps, likely paths that we would have taken? Some of that really resonated with me. So I do a lot of research up front and then start writing. I don't plot out the novel, as you suggested. I am a pantser, by the seat of my pants, and you are required to answer this question at the end of this. And but I let the book evolve, and sometimes that means learning other things because now something's come up I didn't know I needed to know. So then there's more research to be done. But I'm very curious now for Razor Blade Tears. Did you see that whole book coming? Because man, that was explosive and action-packed. But there was a lot of really deep, meaningful depth to these characters' lives and the experiences they've been through, particularly as, ex-cons. And so how much do you know up front? How much do you discover along the way?
For it, when I sat down to write, I had an eye to different men. I want to talk. I'm so it's my heart in my home. So I am setting a book somewhere else because in research I do. I like to just write, so I kind of easy for possible. But the initial idea was and then I kind of just extrapolated it out. So I'm not so much a pantser. I like to write like these. I like to write these and little vignettes and I turn into a complete story. But now amazing. I have a question. Rewrites do you usually do? I'll be honest. I usually end up doing about 3. It's my initial. I go maybe one more good pass. So between 3 and 4. I'm curious, what's your process look like?
Well, so since I never know what's going to happen, so the vision for One Step Too Far is Frankie, kind of on a whim, joins this 1-week search party of 8, headed in the woods, determined once and for all to find this poor lost kid, Timothy O'Day. That I know. What happens after that, I don't know so much. And part of it becomes, I like to let the psychology kind of take over of the book. We know the father who's leading the charge, and he's very, very angry. His wife's dying of cancer. His son's gone in the woods. Life has not been fair. And he's such a good guy. That feels wrong to him. We have the family friends, the groomsmen, the best friends. They're guilt-stricken and just shut down. We have a Bigfoot hunters who's trying to help out. We have the search dog handler, and we have a guide. And so it's more like looking at that group dynamic and kind of seeing where would this go? And how would this feel to Frankie? She doesn't know any of these people, and their lives are kind of in her hands, and she influences them. And because it's messy, I don't always make the right choices, I guess. I'm going to be honest, Sean. The first draft is something no one else ever has to see. So I almost rewrite every day what I wrote the day before. And then even getting to like, now there's 100 pages. Now I want to look at it all and rewrite it all. And then still the complete manuscript, I rewrite again. And then I send it to my editor and I rewrite it again. And then there's cold readers. And yeah, I'm not an efficient writer, I think is what we've established. I don't even know how to count.
I think we share that. Just to your point, yeah, the first draft, I always feel like it's like you said before we came on the air, it's the sausage being made, it's the down and dirty details that you can adjust, and so I made a lot of mistakes in the first draft of both Blacktop Wasteland and Razorblade Tears that were corrected in later drafts. And so I definitely think for to work those kinks out as you go. Some folks that actually sent in some questions. I know Frankie's a new character, but you've had some books with some long-running characters as well. So I was just wondering, maybe your favorite, but maybe your top 3.
Oh, no, that's to me. That's like naming favorite children. I can't be done. You are brilliant, but can you name your favorite character? I mean, you can't do it. And so what I keep doing now is I keep bringing them back together. So like 2 books ago, I had When You See Me, and it was books from like 3 different things, and none of it's planned. Before She Disappeared was going to be standalone for Frankie, but then there was just another great opportunity. And now people are like, Frankie and Detective Dee Warren should be in a book together in Boston. And I got to admit, that kind of makes a lot of sense. But see, this is the thing. I don't plan ahead. We're all just going to find out together, and it will be a beautiful, messy song in progress. Yes.
I am slowly and unintentionally creating the S.A. Cosby shared universe. Because
nice. See, and isn't it nice when it happens?
Yeah, I didn't intend to do it, but I had characters from Blacktop Wasteland that were referenced in Razorblade Tears 2 specifically. I have a character from my first novel that was published by Independent Press that's referenced in Blacktop Wasteland, and there's a whole lot of like cross-pollination, and it sort of grew organically because everybody that I write about lives within 200 square miles of each other. So criminals are going to know other criminals. The cops are going to know bad guys. People are going to know people by reputation. So that's sort of where that came from. So I see that happening with your work, and I feel like, whew, if Lisa can do it, I can do it. It's fine. So
I think it's fun. I mean, I think most of us, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, and readers, please feel free to correct me, but I feel most of us read for character. I mean, we want a good thrilling plot and plot twists, but it's the characters that keep us coming. It's the depth you have in Razorblade Tears. I mean, the action sequences and the dialogue are phenomenal. But it's the fact that these 2 fathers their pain becomes so searing and so personal to us. That's what keeps you coming back. So if you have the opportunity to revisit any of them in the future, of course, it's like a gift to the reader, and it's a gift to us because, we created them, and I miss them at a certain point. I don't know about you, Sean, but they're like children out in the world, and I just want them to come home again.
I'll tell you, there's like, I've written, oh gosh, so many short stories and 3 crime novels now, and some other long forms. And yeah, I do miss the characters. They're characters that I grow close to. They're characters that are villains that have charmed me in spite of them being villains. I have a character in Blacktop Wasteland named Ronnie Sessions, and God, he's he's so duplicitous. As my grandma will say, when he died, they're going to screw him in the ground. He's so crooked. But he just stuck with me. He's just charming in spite of himself. And even though he does some bad things, he's a character I would love to write more about. Of course, Bug is a character I would love to write about. I'm working on something now where, like I said, I think a lot of characters are going to make cameos. But anyway.
I think, and see, readers love that, and we love that. So it's perfect. It's all good.
I wanted to ask this another question from some readers. And okay, what are your favorite thriller books and authors in any thriller book or film? So basically they're asking, what are our favorite books that we've read that are thrillers, and what are any books that inspired us? So I'll let you answer first, and I'll give
Oh,
my
good.
answer.
Because this is actually one of my favorite questions, because I'm still a huge reader. So I'm always looking for other people's answers. And when I do book signings, I'm like, you have to come to me. You have to tell me your favorite author, because I'm always looking for people to read. So, I mean, in the near future alone. So Greg Hurwitz is one of my favorites with his Orphan X series.
Yeah.
And in just a few weeks, we'll have the next installment of that. Karen Slaughter is a huge favorite of mine. Lisa Unger, love Joe Finder. I mean, I think most of us in, Lee Child, the Jack Reacher series remains up there. I read a lot of young adult as well. In fact, I read across a lot of genres because I'm more character driven. So like I love Sarah J. Maas. One of the huge breakout books right now that I had to read over Christmas was Iron Widow in the YA market. For any of you who if Primal Rage had a narrative, I'm pretty sure Iron Widow is it. I'm still thinking about it, but I like those books where you're so into the character's experience and their emotions. I just had an opportunity to read S.A. Cosby's Razorblade Tears, which I thought was stunning, and the dialogue. And I loved, you have this really fabulous line, and it's, I never remember, I read so much, I don't do great with remember characters' names. I think it's Isaiah of just, was it okay to mourn his son so strongly when he loved him so poorly? And those kinds of lines to me were in the middle of thrillers or fantasy or these action adventures. Any story that then grounds it to something that's so human, something that all of us wrestle with, longing, regret, passion. Those are the books that captivate me. And there's some really great authors out there right now.
Thank you for saying that about Razorblade Tears. And I concur with you about Greg Horowitz. I think he's an incredible writer. For me, a couple authors that are instant buys. For me, Riley Sager.
Yes, Riley Sager.
He writes such lean, mean stories that are like, they're stories that almost feel like a conversation you had in a bar where somebody's like, man, let me tell you this thing that happened to my friend, and ... So Riley Sager is great. Of course, I was inspired, but I'm an old school guy, so I love Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. It's one of my favorite books.
That's actually my favorite. That's my favorite of all of his is Red Dragon. Silence of the Lamb has more buzz, and it's a great book, but Red Dragon is the best.
Red Dragon is so powerful. It's one of those books you're different after you've read it. It's an experience. It's a trial by fire, in my personal opinion. One of my favorite authors is also a friend of mine, so I'm a little biased, but Jennifer Hillier writes some of the most incredible, dark crime fiction. Oh my gosh, she
Jars and Hearts of Jars. Yeah. Excellent. Jar of Hearts. That's it. Excellent book. You absolutely should be reading it. Yes, I agree.
I love her work. She's an incredible writer, and she makes it look so effortless that I know it's incredibly difficult. And I admire her skill with that. So those are a couple that are inspirations and ones that I read, or I always look for them when I'm in Barnes and Noble. If they've got a new book out, I'm instantly gonna wreck my budget and buy it. So
I spend a lot of money in Barnes and Noble. I agree with you.
Let's see here. This is I love this question. The person asked, if you could make your books into TV and movie, who would you cast as a lead? So I always do fantasy casting for my own books. So I'm interested, who would you see as Frankie if you could? If you could have any actress, any time period, who would you see as Frankie?
Well, so I never pictured this stuff, so I got obscenely lucky. So before she disappeared quite recently, Hilary Swank optioned it, and she wants to play the part of Frankie. It will be her and E1 producing it, and she will star in it. And I have to say, it's the highlight of my 2021 was to be able to be on a Zoom call with Hilary Swank, and she looked it perfectly. And I'm not one of those people that pictures anyone. And she reminded me of Frankie in that she seemed very accessible and down to earth. And I think one of Frankie's kind of shticks as a heroine is, she's not elevated. She's not an authority figure. She's not badass. She's not kick-ass. She listens really well. and she's empathetic, and people start to tell her their stories, and that's how she starts to fit puzzles together. And talking to Hilary Swank, it's like, I would tell you anything, just anything. Now, you have big news, you have exciting news, so talk about this a little bit for us as well.
Well, both Blacktop Wasteland and Razor Blade Tears have been optioned for movies. Blacktop Wasteland was optioned by a production company called Picture Start. They're in conjunction with John Legend's Get Lifted Productions. So that script has been written and they're working on that now.
Nice.
And Razor Blade Tears was optioned by Paramount Pictures, Paramount Players, and in association with Jerry Bruckheimer. And talking about Zoom calls, I got to be on a Zoom call with Jerry Bruckheimer, which, I mean, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have told you to get your head examined if you thought that was going to happen.
Isn't that
cool?
And
I can't speak for anybody else, but I went from working 60 hours a week as a retail manager in a hardware store to sitting in front of a Zoom board with Jerry Bruckheimer. So it's a dream. Everything else after this is gravy for me. But if
there's
I had
so much of our jobs that is just totally surreal. Yeah. It's like, I can't actually believe, because we just sit down, we make things up. We're very grateful you guys buy them. We're grateful Barnes and Noble carries them. We're very grateful the books exist. And then you get these crazy things like so-and-so wants to talk to you. And you're just like, wait, what?
When I was writing Razor Blade Tears, I will say I did envision two actors that I think might be too old now. But in my mind, Ike was Delroy Lindo and Buddy Lee was Sam Elliott. Those are the two people I had in my head when I wrote the book. There's sort of a running joke through Razor Blade Tears that people tell Buddy Lee he looks like a rundown Sam Elliott. And as the book goes on, he gets more beat up. He looks like a more worse version of Sam Elliott. So I thought that was kind of a good running joke. But yeah, those are the guys that I envisioned in my head. Now, I don't know who's going to get the role, and I can't say who's talked, who's been in contact yet, but it's hopefully it's all break out really well, because some of the people that names that have been bandied about are very interesting. But I want to get back to Frankie for a second. You said that Hilary Swank made you realize that Frankie is somebody that you could talk to, that she's not a superheroine. She's not, ex-Green Beret or anything like that. She's just a very determined, somewhat nosy person. And I thought, this came to me when I was reading the book, she's like a younger version of Jessica Fletcher in a way, where she's just here, this person, and it's sort of the Columbo thing. Not that people don't take her seriously, but she's not threatening. And because she's not threatening, people open up to her. Because she's not intimidating, because she's not someone that they feel that is scary, they open up, and that's what allows her to, ultimately solve the mystery. And so I thought that was interesting. And I love that you did make her just a regular person. And that the only thing that she has driving her is her insatiable curiosity. I think that's a throwback to like mystery amateur sleuths of the early 20th century, the Philo Vances and Ellery Queens and stuff like that. So I as an old school mystery fan, I was a huge fan of that. I enjoyed that.
So let's talk about this a little. Wait, no, I want to talk about this for a second though there, Sean, because I think this is something that's happening in our business in general, because I noticed it with Razor Blade Tears. Like, you're not using the internet, you're not using the cell phones. I think one of the things that's a little challenging writing a thriller in this day and age is at a certain point is like, oh, well, there's forensics for that. There's, GPS is tracking that. Oh, the computer can tell you that. And I think part of the reason at this stage of my career, I was drawn to the amateur sleuth, like you're saying, kind of going more old school, was one of the first things we learned about Frankie is she doesn't have the money for a computer. She doesn't even have a smartphone. She has some cheap, pay-as-you-go track phone, flip phone. She really has to rely on herself. And I think for me, that's just harking back to, I miss the day and age where it was the human connections that mattered. And it was the human connections that had the answers. It wasn't you Googled something, you hacked something, a lab test told you something. You talked to people and you learned something. And that's really what Frankie's all about. I think in Razor Blade Tears, you see that very old school approach to vengeance. These men, their sons have been murdered, and they're not turning to the police. They're not turning to the computer. They're not. I mean, again, it's very old school. This is a direct threat, a direct pain to us. And we want direct action, to alleviate our pain. And I think there's a part of all of us that misses that a little, that we're maybe have a little too much technology, a little too many barriers in our lives. And that's just up close and personal, one person to another person, now has some romanticism to it.
You raise an interesting point. I know, and I've talked to other writers about this, the idea of writing around modern technology, around smartphones, around triangulation of cell towers. And it can be a blessing and a curse, because sometimes you have to have your characters think around those problems. Like, for instance, in Black Top Wasteland, I had it's a heist novel, so I had all the criminals by burner phones that they instantly tossed away because they couldn't use their regular phones. So you have to think around those things. But like you said, to your point, I also do kind of harken back to that idea of the main character having to rely on themselves, that they're not the guy or gal in a room who's just pulling up reams of information, that they're actually got to get out and into the environment and learn and pick up clues. And like you said, just kind of one-on-one interaction. I think, I may be wrong and readers can tell me this, but I think that is what some people look for in a book, that you don't want to experience the 21st century of instant gratification. You want to find a mystery that's put together piece by piece by piece, which is interesting because setting one step too far in Wyoming, off the grid, away from all those things, even besides the fact that Frankie, poor thing, is so broken, I've been there, that she didn't have a smartphone, but the fact that they're out of cell phone range and so on and so forth. I think that is a brilliant way of setting a scene and creating more tension within the dynamic between the characters. And so I thought that was just a masterful plot device, not a contrivance, but actually a plot device to force those characters to not only depend on each other, but also interact with each other. Somebody told me, and I can't think of who it is, good writing is putting your character in a tree and throwing rocks at them. And putting these characters in the wilderness and throwing rocks at them, I thought had great results. I'm going to tell on myself a little bit, because as a kid growing up, I was a huge fan of In Search Of. So I know a lot about Bigfoot, more than I should. And so more than is comfortable at cocktail parties.
I should have consulted you, is what you're telling me.
And so I want to know, this is not a reader question. This is my question. I want to know what inspired you to put a Bigfoot hunter in the book, because it is masterful. I love it. I love it so much.
So one of the fun things about One Step Too Far is I have a cast of 8. It's the first time I've written a book where it's that small. And like you said, they quit very quickly. They're in the deep remote wilderness of Wyoming. There's no cell phones, there's no sat phones, there's no help. And this is even intentional. They know this going into this. They chose this for themselves in order to find this lost hiker. And so I started to construct, well, who would be on such a search? So you need a Wyoming guide, because one of the things about Wyoming is that you have a lot of trails that aren't marked. You need local knowledge. The way it would work in the real world doing such a search is it has to be privately funded at this point. Remember, the volunteers are gone and no one can agree on whose jurisdiction it is. So that's the father. He needs manpower. That's the guilt-stricken friends who were there when their friend disappeared. You definitely want a search dog. And in this case, really want a cadaver dog, Daisy, who quickly becomes one of my favorite characters. This I knew. And then when I go to do all the research, the thing I did not know we needed, but we clearly did need, was Bigfoot Bob. Because in modern day and age, and I'm not making this up, all the shows you watch, Sean, did not steer you wrong. The best source of data we have on nationwide, how many people are missing on national public lands, comes from the North American Bigfoot Association. They're the ones tracking anomalies in the woods. And they often get involved with search and rescue. And in fact, particularly in the Olympic Peninsula, which is kind of considered probably the most prime Bigfoot territory. And I come from Oregon, so I knew some of this from being an Oregonian as well. They're still looking for lost hikers. I mean, these are people who are a huge source of local knowledge. They know the woods. They're very interested in what's going on in the woods. And they're actually even engaged in a whole mapping project of everything that's gone wrong in the woods. And that's one of those things I didn't know, but once I knew it, we had to have Bigfoot Bob. I love Bigfoot Bob.
I love Bigfoot, Bob. Like I said, I was a huge Sasquatch enthusiast as a kid and a young adult. And I went on it. I actually, again, another story I have to tell you when we get to see each other in person, went on an ill-fated Bigfoot hunt in my 20s.
Oh, these are good. Grizzly bears and Bigfoot. You are like the person I've always needed to meet there, Sean. We're going to need 2 nights in the bar in New York at this point.
I wanted to ask you something, and I don't know how many people know this, so I'm curious myself. Well, how did you get your start? And I'll tell you my story. We could trade stories here, but I'm curious about, did you always want to be a writer? Did you always know you wanted to be a writer? And when you did finally realize I want to be a writer, how long did it take you to really get started?
Well, I really want to hear your story because my story is a little out of date, but I will share it. But I'm getting much more into what's more current for today. So honestly enough, and I'm going to date myself here, I have been a published author for 30 years now, which is a bit embarrassing. But I was a small town kid in Oregon. My family is farming. My grandparents were dairy farmers. We spent our summers on the dairy farm. We read a lot at the library because they kind of wanted us out of the way. And we milked a lot of cows and cleaned a lot of things we don't need to mention in a podcast. And I just read a lot. And the more you read, when I was 17, I decided I wanted to try to write a novel. And I did. And then I stuck it under a bed because I lived in Oregon and I'd never met an agent, an editor in New York. All those things seemed just a million miles away. It wasn't really till I went off to college and I told people, oh, over the summer I wrote a book. They're kind of like, well, are you going to do something with it? And to be honest, I mean, I never dreamed of it. It's not what my family does. We're more practical. My job's a little odd in the family construct. But came back, started reading some books. And this was back in the day when paperbacks were huge. Publishers were actively looking for them. So there were some instructions you could follow. And I submitted, no agent, just submitted to New York. Took a few years and an editor took a chance on it. I had a 20-page single-space revision letter. And I made hardly any money at all. I mean, I had 10 years of a published author where I wrote, books a year, and, that paid for my first computer, and then 10 years into it, I'm like, this is really what I want to do. Because I had all other jobs the whole time. So I got an agent and she said, you should write a suspense thriller. You're really good at dialogue and violence. And, I come from farmers. I'm like, violence. Yep, I get it. So I came up with a serial killer book and that became my 10 years later overnight success. And this is what I do now.
I got to tell you, I think there's something to growing up in a rural environment that makes you really good at writing violence, because I grew up in rural Virginia. My family were fishermen. They were all watermen.
Oh, interesting.
Crab fishermen, oyster fishermen, scallop fishermen. My dad was a fisherman for most of his life. And so I always wanted to be a writer. I always wanted to tell stories. I grew up around storytellers. I grew up around a lot of backyard raconteurs and barbecue orators. I had a strong oral tradition in my family of passing down stories from, grandfathers and uncles and great aunts and family legends. So I went to college. I had to come out of college. I had to drop out in my junior year. My mom got really, really sick, so I had to come and take care of her.
Yeah.
But I kept writing. And so for the next 10 years, I eked out a short story here or there. But my big break, I guess, was when I wrote My Darkest Prayer, which was a short novel for a small independent firm called Intrigue Publishing. And that got me a little notice. I went to a big writers convention called BoucherCon in St. Petersburg. And while I was there, I got into a conversation with a gentleman in the lobby who was an agent. I didn't know it at the time. And our conversation went really well. And he said, hey, are you represented by anybody? Are you working on anything? I said, well, I've got this small town heist novel I wrote, but I'm not with anyone currently. And he said, well, when you get home, send me the book. I want to read it. I said, we just been talking in the lobby. He said, no, I like the way you think. I like the way you talk. He said, I'm interested to see how you write. And I'm like, okay. So I got home and I didn't do anything for a while. And a friend of mine was like, are you going to send that book in? And I was like, oh, that guy's probably full of it. And they were like, doesn't hurt to try. So I sent it in. I sent him the whole book in November 2018. He signed me in December 2018. He sold it to Flatiron Books in February of 2019. So it was a 15 year overnight success. So that's where I came from. But I always wanted to write. I'll tell you a real quick funny story. I know we're running short on time. When I was a kid, my mom used to hate reading bedtime stories to me because I would complain about the ending. I was already looking for plot holes in the bedtime story. I was like, why doesn't the wolf just knock the house down? Stop trying to blow it down. Just knock it down. And my mom was like, why don't you write your own damn story? So anyway, that's where that came from.
I like it.
We have a couple more questions from readers that I want to get to before we go. Let's see. Here's one. Let's see. Here's a good one. And if it's a spoiler, you don't have to go into too much detail. But someone want to know, what was the hardest scene to write in One Step Too Far? I got a guess on what it is, but I'm not going to say anything. And see if you want to let us know what that was for you.
You know, I know.
If it's a spoiler, don't say it.
Yeah, I can't. There's a scene that was a revelation even to me. So what I like about writing is the magic moments you didn't even know. Like, I mean, this makes us both sound like we're crazy, but I know you're there with me, Sean, where it's like someone else is taking over. And I mean, you did do your research and you thought you knew these characters and you thought you had some sense of the plot. And there's this day and it just happens and you knew it had to happen. And that's exactly right. And if you did have an outline, well, now you have to throw away the outline. Or if you didn't, well, now you're saved because you know what's happening next. But either way, this was the moment. Those are the scenes that really stick with me, and inevitably they're visceral. I will say the most touching scene for me was, and this isn't a spoiler then, and before she disappeared, we know Frankie has some backstory, but we never get into it because I think of Frankie as a character that lives so in the here and now that we don't really need to go too backwards. We don't even need to go too forwards. She's always in the moment. But when I went to write One Step Too Far, it is such a book of fathers. I mean, this whole search party is being driven by this father and his love and his obsession for finding his son. But of course, Frankie has to think of her own. And some of those scenes and the relationship she has with her own father, who is also an alcoholic. And yet, he's not the quintessential abusive drunk. He's kind of a cute drunk, but he's a lazy drunk. But, her love-hate relationship with him and why couldn't he be stronger and watching their parents' marriage, but she loved him. She loved him so much and just trying to understand, but he always loved booze more. And then there becomes the day she loves booze more. And she's never had the opportunity to talk about him because then her parents died. And that kind of unfinished business, I think, is a lot of what drives Frankie to try to find closure for other people. Because so much of her life and her relationships, there will not be answers now. There will not be resolution now. They just are what they are.
I think that's incredibly powerful. And I think that's probably a great place to sort of wrap things up.
The downer thought.
No. It's a beautiful thought. And I share that understanding. Also, I do understand when you're talking about when you're writing, sometimes it feels like you're just raising your hand to the heavens and the muses are sending lightning bolts down.
Thank you.
I always say something. I always feel like I'm recording on something that I saw, not so much something I created. But anyway, I just want to say thank you to Barnes & Noble for having us. Thank you to everyone that checked in and came in and listened to the discussion. I know we sort of rambled a little bit. That's my fault. Charge that to me.
I always ramble.
But if you haven't done so yet, please pick up One Step Too Far. It is a masterful novel, an incredibly suspenseful book, and really a powerful mediation on loss and what it means to accept the circumstances that you've been set in. And I think that's a lesson that we all can take to heart. Again, I want to thank Barnes & Noble for having me. I want to thank Lisa Gardner for allowing me to take up time this afternoon. And again, thank you to everyone in the audience that was listening. This has been an incredibly pleasurable conversation for me. And it'll have to hold me until we get to see each other in person.
June, Thriller Fest. And everyone, you should come too. If you love thriller books at all, please come. And we're going to be in person because we just we're determined at this point, and it's going to be fun. And Sean and I have a lot of catching up to do in the bar, so just find us there.
I'll be there in a hazmat suit if I have to be. I got to see people. I don't know about anybody else, but I am an extroverted person, and I need people like a plant needs light. So anyway, on that note, thank you again to everyone that checked in. Thank you for everyone that was listening. Thank you to Barnes & Noble for having us. You guys have a great afternoon. Again, please go pick up One Step Too Far. It is a masterful book. It'll probably be on a lot of best of lists this year. And again, thank you so much, Lisa, for letting me speak with you. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to Barnes & Noble, and thank you so much, Sean. This was so much fun.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.